As for Joff's today's talk, I think it raises two important questions, and they are both interconnected. The first one is related to Deleuze and Guattari's relation to Wilhelm Reich. How Deleuze and Guattari read and interpret or disinterpret Reich is a huge question, and I totally agree with Joff that this important question has been neglected in Deleuze-Guattarian secondary literature so far, which, and this is also a point I have to agree with, has to do with certain deficit in what Joff calls philosophy of joy. Because today philosophers usually serve as state officials in a good old Hegelian way, or as the servants of capitalist systems that basically sells the university degrees to students. And philosophers just pretend doing philosophy in this context. And what we forget is precisely the old experience of joy that we share with others, the joy that thinking makes possible, basically the experience of thinking as a joyful affair. And therefore I'm really happy we have this opportunity to remember what actually thinking as a joyful affair means. And this is already bringing me to the second point that Joff raises in his talk, namely what has happened not only to desire, but what has happened to all of us in those post-COVID times. Because the phenomenon of social reclusion, or what has been labeled in Japan as a Hikikomori, became a global phenomenon, and we have witnessed and experienced the societies that all over the world basically forced their members to more or less voluntary, I would say less voluntary social reclusion. The question is, how can we come out of this global social reclusion, and how can we rediscover this essential quality of joy that we share with others when exchanging ideas, when thinking together. And this is why I'm really happy, and I can thank you enough for being here with us, Jeff, that you will also present your lecture. So
thank you very much. Thanks. Well, thank you, Peter. That's absolutely wonderful. And I'd like to thank, of course, the Institute of Contemporary Continental Philosophy at the Czech Academy of Sciences for allowing me to come and talk about something I feel very strongly about. So before I start, just to kind of situate where I'm coming from, that I've been writing on post-media for some years now, and I have, this is shameless, I know, but this will come out this year on schizoanalysis and Asia. It's something like 14 years of my research, so kind of I will be very happy when it's published, so I can forget about it. But and I have another book on schizoanalysis and post-media, which will come out with Bloomsbury as well this year. So there's two books there, and I decided to do it on schizoanalysis because it's 50 years now since the publication of Anti-Oedipus. So Deleuze and Guattari's kind of groundbreaking work. And the work I've been doing on this is in the Asian context. So I've been working with colleagues in India and Korea and Japan. Been to New Delhi, Jamia Millia Islamia, the university there, with the Manoj NY, and then in Korea at Kyunghee University with Tai Kwang Lee, my colleague. And we've been trying to work out this thing like post-media. What is it? Guattari's concept of post-media. And it seems to me that you might say that post-media is kind of anachronistic. It's kind of, that era is gone now, because our time is the time of the internet, it's the World Wide Web, it's, you know, it's mobile phones and things like that. So that work seems to have passed its sell-by date, but I don't agree with that. So then we have been trying to resurrect the concept of post-media, and this work is ongoing in Japan. There are Japanese scholars who write on post-media, and the Japanese government supports them, but their work is very sociological. It's about sociology, really, and that's not my take on it. Something else I think needs to come out of it. And so the latest thing I'm doing is with the Academy of Korean Studies, and that's my idea about that is to revisit what Sadie Plant did, the British, very good, brilliant writer, Sadie Plant. What she did for Motorola when young people first started to use mobile phones. So she got some assistance from Motorola, and she went around the world to big cities, and she just observed how people were using new technology, and she wrote about it. Again, that was quite sociological, but my project, which I'll begin in September, is to go to Korea, to go to Seoul, and to do a kind of psychogeography project there, and to say something, hopefully, philosophical about it, and then to come back to Japan and to do the same. So my project then will be in New Delhi, will be in Tokyo, and will be in Seoul. So that's the kind of backdrop to that. But as I said, I'm going to talk about the Hikikomori syndrome, if you like, and this is a kind of very serious thing that is taking place. And just to give you the kind of etymology of it, the Japanese, the hiki of it means to pull back. So I'm going to talk later about Reich and the wormy man, and to try and connect that with the hikikomori. So the komori would be to come into, so it's a kind of pulling back and pulling into. And what was a kind of almost a cultural kind of description of the hikikomori has now become more kind of endemic almost, and it's been linked with depression and with internet addiction and people on the autistic spectrum and things like that. So it's taking on a more medical description, and it's not just young people. It's spreading to all generations. So someone like Scott Wilson will say it's a middle-class syndrome, but I don't agree with that at all. And it was started in Japan, but now it's spread to other Asian countries, South Korea and India and so on, and also further afield to Europe. I mean, there is research in Scotland, in Great Britain, about the syndrome there as well. And the numbers are very kind of startling, really. I mean, Saito Tamaki is the writer of the Hikikomori, and he says the number could get to 10 million, which of a population of nearly 70 million. Japan is quite significant, really. And the Japanese government estimates there's like 1 million out of 126 million, so that's still significant, and there's a description of it. The demographic would be from, well, it used to be from 18 to 35, but it's been expanded. And then there is research noted in Korea, the same kind of definition you can find in Korea and Hong Kong. And my point is, it's no longer a culturally kind of bound phenomenon, but it's taken on a more international dimension and a more medical description as well. So that's the kind of description. But again, you might just say that's a kind of sociological observation, but I want to say something philosophical about it. So I've got my favourite quotes from Deleuze and Guattari, so you're going to have to just put up with me in the small print there. But these will be some quotations which will guide my talk, and you can see the first one says, this is from Anti-Oedipus, and why such a dreary parade of sucked up, dry, catatonized, vitrified, sewn up bodies, when the body without organs is also full of gaiety, ecstasy and dance. Okay, so when I was a younger man, 20s, this point really kind of struck me, and it still abides. So what am I going to talk about? Well, there are two things I'm going to talk about. One is about Wilhelm Reich, one of Freud's favourite students, a protégé of Freud, a psychoanalyst who influenced R.D. Laing a great deal. And R.D. Laing wrote two papers, I think, on Wilhelm Reich, and wrote an introduction to one of Reich's books. So there's that, and of course there is Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. So you can see R.D. Laing featuring in Anti-Oedipus a great deal, and the secondary literature doesn't say very much about R.D. Laing anymore. He's fallen out of favour after Guattari kind of bashed him around a little bit in his solo work, and we never hear anything about Wilhelm Reich. So why is that? Okay, so as we know that Deleuze and Guattari, they reject some of the kind of wilder ideas of Reich, the kind of Reich's kind of box where you climb into and somehow you kind of commune with the world. They reject these kind of ideas. But my point is whether this rejection, we can say, goes together with the rejection of the philosophy of affirmation in our contemporary moment. And I would say that Reich is absent, conspicuously absent, in the secondary literature on Deleuze and Guattari. I mean, everyone knows the refrain, desire, desiring, repression. It's always repeated. But if you push people, they won't know much more, right? They'll make a link between desire and fascism, maybe, but apart from that, it's just not there. And why is that? Okay. Well, I think it's kind of it's almost symptomatic, really, regarding the kind of movement away from the philosophy of joy. So I'll talk about the philosophy of joy in a moment. Okay, so my second kind of thing I want to do is to use Reich to think about the question of social recluse, the question of Hikikomori, and why is that so, and how can we put those two things together. So I want to, and the way I've done it is to think about Reich's concept of the worm in man. Okay, the worm in man, which I think is a kind of description of how social relations have been petrified and somehow help us to describe what societies like Japan and Korea have become. And Guattari would call this a kind of a chaosmic plunge towards abolition. Okay, it's a wonderful phrase. So I'm trying to think about the Hikikomori, social recluse, and this kind of devastation, what's occurring. So I'm interested in understanding, well, that would be the kind of description. So I'm looking for more prescription as well. So I'm interested in understanding the kind of plasticity of collective subjectivity, okay? So I want to treat subjectivity positively in the Guattarian sense to see it's kind of how we can get out of the mess, basically. So how can we rethink kind of social withdrawal, okay? What does the Hikikomori say about desire? And then how I've been doing this in the work I mentioned is to look at Reich's work on cancer. Reich talks about cancer and the question of fascism, to think about the worm in man, what he calls, or what I will explain in a moment about that, and this idea of coexistence. In the Japanese it's kyosei. Okay, it's very popular now. People always talk about coexistence. And it struck me, what is this idea of coexistence? It features a lot in research now in the universities. What is coexistence? Well, if we think this idea of kyose, it means coexistence, but it also means parasite. Okay, and someone like Murakami Ryu, the Japanese writer, explains this brilliantly. He says that coexistence is parasitical. Okay, so we Hikikomori is a kind of parasitical kind of reality. We need it, but we also have a kind of question of coexistence as well. He does it very well to explain this. And I thought that was brilliant. So Murakami Ryu would connect with Wilhelm Reich, and then you can think about this idea of a kind of almost like cancerous forms of the body. Okay, so that's how I've been trying to work it out. So anyway, so as I said, this is a kind of retrospective on Anti-Oedipus, really. 50 years since the publication of this work, and some people in the secondary literature kind of try to escape looking at Deleuze and Guattari's joint work and focus more on Deleuze, and think this book, as Foucault says, is quite nutty, and you know. But I still think there's something in that. So, okay, so this is about Anti-Oedipus. I'm going to think about contact, okay? Social withdrawal, hikikomori, contact, things like that. So this is where I begin. So I want to think about the idea of contact as a kind of skin, okay? An epidermis between sense and nonsense, contact and contactlessness. And I'm interested in exploring how the hikikomori practices a kind of contactlessness, okay, away from the world, or what I'm going to call the deadly ipseity of desire. Okay, deadly ipseity of desire. And ipse comes from the self, okay, right. So I want to think about the indeterminate contact zone between where somehow the rules no longer make sense. Something is broken down. There's a breakdown, okay. So part of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophical project is to look for the breakthrough, but in some ways, all we can see in our moment is breakdown. So where is the breakthrough? This is not just Wilhelm Reich, but also R.D. Lang as well. R.D. Lang's project was always to look for this prosexual schizophrenia as a kind of breakthrough. Okay, it's kind of risky business, but people like Reich and R.D. Lang and Deleuze and Guattari even always interested in this idea of breakdown. So what's happened there? Well, in the time of the pandemic, the idea of somehow like a non-life almost, right? We're kind of living a kind of bare life or non-life, means we have to rethink the sense of desire, this desire for contact. What does it mean to resist contact? To be without contact, to be without desire. What does it mean to risk contact, to risk being tactile with other people, with the other, to risk affirming one's desires? What does that mean? So I'm making the case for a kind of chaosmosis of skin and contact. And as I said, I'm kind of looking at the phenomenological experience of crisis as a kind of zone of indeterminacy between contact and contactlessness. So I want to know what's happened to desire, to its promise and possibility, and why is it so difficult to anticipate that breakthrough, what is to come? Why is it so difficult to envisage what might get us out of this mess? Here's my next quote. So Deleuze and Guattari say, how is it possible that the schizo, nobody talks about the schizo anymore, it's very embarrassing when we talk about schizos. How is it possible that the schizo was conceived of as the autistic rag, separated from the real and cut off from life? And that we always think that that's what it's become. So there's an idea about the autistic kind of behaviour Deleuze and Guattari mentioned. Well, just to give, come back to Japan, so I'm going to and fro between kind of my experience in Japan and then the philosophical observation of it. So here is a kind of vignette. My student says she wants to experience death. Experience her being towards death, as she calls it. And of course, there's a service for this in Korea. Okay, what you do, you can recline into a coffin, and you can experience solitude and loneliness and all the darkness that lies therein. Another student pipes up and she says, the idea of withdrawing from technology has sparked her interest. She wants to go on a weekend retreat away from her mobile phone. And she says, I'm addicted to my phone, so I want to get away from it. And another student says, teachers are a drag. We all say that, right? But right. So the teachers are a drag, and because he's got his mobile phone in his hands, so he doesn't need the teacher anymore. This, in a way, this is what Michel says. And another student says he wants a robot teacher. And of course, in Korea, there is a robot teacher you can service. You know, robot teachers now do this for you, right? And another, why is this so? Because humans are too much trouble, he says. Huh? And another student says, well, why not get married to a robot? Or be married by a robot priest. You can go to Japan and this is a service for you. And when you end your life, when your life comes to an end, why not have the robot read the rites, a robot priest? And there's another example of that. So I think this is absolutely bonkers what they talk about, but we talk about something more mundane, about going overseas to study, right? And we talk about the merits and demerits. And most of the students say, and this was before Corona, not just during, but they say it's bothersome. There's a lot of risk. Not necessarily because of the virus, the risk of that, but when they get back, it's difficult to get a job. So they're concerned about getting a job, right? Very pragmatic, fine. So I listen to all of this and I think, what has happened to the desire for voyages, other worlds, or clandestine gatherings, or romantic encounters? What's happened to all of that? What's happened to desire? What has happened to that book, Anti-Oedipus, published in 1972? Okay. And in some ways, what's happened to that question of desire? And someone like Franco Berardi will say, in some ways, that book has kind of anticipated our neoliberal kind of regime. And somehow, the book now, when we read it, we can see a cut from desire and from pleasure. This is what he says, right? Something's happened there. I want to know what's happened to the contemporary vibrations or flows or schizzes or the knots of desire. Okay, so that's where the Reich and the R.D. Lang come in. I want to know, why have we passed from Strömung, from streaming, to stimming? Stimming would be that kind of excessive repetition that we do, right? Kind of almost unconscious kind of reflexes. How we pass from Strömung to stimming to the body without organs of the Hikikomori? What's happened there? So there's another quote here. It's a bit of a long one. This is from Deleuze and Guattari as well. They say, before being a mental state of the schizophrenic who has made himself into an artificial person through autism, schizophrenia is the process of the production of a desire and desiring machines. How does one get from one to the other? And this transition, how is it inevitable? So again, the idea of autism is mentioned there. Okay, so let's think about flow. So we embark, okay, in our journey of desire. We embark. Flow, current, drift, errancy, wandering, carried away towards new worlds and futures, finding new directions, trends and tendencies, embracing the flux of existence, the stream of consciousness which emerge out into the world. We arrive, though, collapsed, a collapsed body without organs, stimming away in deadly repetition. Self-stimulation with physical movements, sounds, words, moving objects in a coil of inner blankness. This is Reich's term, okay? Inertia, passivity, and paralysis. In perseveration. That's the kind of thing you do when there's no desire. You just carry on doing it. So there's a repetition to an unhealthy degree. This is beyond desire. So, again, what has happened? Desire. What has caused the drop in intensity to the body without organs of the autistic or the hikikomori? What's happened? What is this limp rag of autistic behaviour? Why do we have a society of neurotics rather than one successful schizophrenic who's made the breakthrough, who's gone beyond this kind of autistic state? So, what does it mean to contact? Contactus means touching. It means to touch each other in a state or condition. It suggests a mutual relation of two things or bodies. External surfaces touch each other, things come into contact, and on that surface there's an appetite for contact and conjunction. Yet contact is different from communication. We make or break contact, we complete or interrupt it. Yet nevertheless something flows irresistibly in between. So a pressure is exerted, a sensation, a pleasure is passed, a metamorphosis occurs. The surface of a wound is in contact with the element. We speak of points of contact on the surface of the skin as one is exposed to infection by proximity to an infectious disease. One is in contact with contagion. We speak of the power of healing by touch, by contact. Contact pertains to the tactility with being with someone or something, or being in contact with someone or something. If there is a sense of contact, if there is a pedagogy to be retrieved, it's in the sense of a certain joy in the face of a risk, uncertainty or adversity. Even a joy in the thrownness towards death. It is in those spaces or moments of life when one must affirm this thing which makes no sense. It's on the epidermis of sense and nonsense that one affirms one's being. On the epidermis of sense and nonsense, contact becomes a problem to be ruminated upon. It's in contact with and on this epidermis that one affirms one's very own sense. Across this epidermis, across the skin, we embrace that which may consume our energies and our powers. And this is perpetual risk. So, what does it mean to be exposed to contamination? To affirm that exposure, that risk, that abandonment. It seems to me that one writer who touches upon this is Alfonso Linguis, arguably the greatest Deleuzian phenomenologist. And he speaks about the collapse of work and reason, this breakdown. When all of the things that one usually takes no notice of fades away, there's an uncanny moment where one finds there is no ground to the everyday, there's no sense. And one is given over to something else. You could call it the real itself. Okay, so this is when we pass beyond the autistic behaviour to some kind of breakthrough. Something is affirmed and experimented upon, and that which is experimented upon is the self itself, the self's almost relation to itself. So, what of the withdrawal of the hikikomori? Okay, another quote from Deleuze and Guattari. Dark world, growing desert, a solitary machine hums on the beach, an atomic factory installed in the desert. Okay, what has happened to the withdrawal of the hikikomori? Well, I think that the experience of hikikomori has become humanity's common experience, an experience of withdrawing, of being contactless, of being incommunicado, of refusing the face of the other, refusing the summons, refusing the demands placed upon it. We become contactless, petrified, frozen, hermetic, narcissistic, autistic, withdrawn. We suffer what Reich calls an inner loneliness, an inner deadness. So, despite the constant streaming of the self, the Strömung, as Reich says, we suffer an emotional contactlessness. Streaming is not the same as a subjective perception of a feeling of aliveness or being in contact with the outside, because nothing flows through the body. There's a feeling of withdrawal from all direct human and non-human contact. So we have less Strömung and more stimming, as I said. Okay, so why turn to Reich? I find in Reich the language to rethink refined or petrified models of psychic life. And in some respects, I think the Hikikomori and the autistic are infantile regressions, which we should not celebrate. And there are some Japanese scholars, Yoshimoto Takaki, a poet and philosopher, who says he can't condone this behavior. Okay, he's almost the opposite take from where I'm come from. And also, I would disagree with the negative readings of Deleuze from people like Andrew Culp and the Japanese scholar Masaya Chiba. These people I am writing against. And compared to those thinkers, I find in Reich's work the language to understand the worm in man and how this has affected social relations. So, this idea we can think of like this. So, in the societies of control thesis, we have the movement from the mole, right, to the serpent. So the movement from the disciplinary society, the mole, to the serpent in our control societies, okay? But I think we can extend this to the tapeworm or the worm in man. So that's pulling back of the Hikikomori. In some way, it helps us to describe what Reich calls the worm in man, or what I call the deadly ipseity of the self. So, let me go back to Japan for a moment and to think about the celibate machine, the anti-Oedipus concept of the Hikikomori, and the description of the tapeworm or the worm in man by Reich, and that's in his character analysis. The movement of desire is described by Reich as wavy, serpentine, pulsating across the total area of the body. Desire is the expressive movement of the wriggling tapeworm. Reich describes the tension charge function, he calls it a TC function, as like this. He says, desire passes from the mechanical tension to bioenergetic charge, and then from to bioenergetic discharge, and then there's a kind of mechanical relaxation. So he gives some examples. Jellyfish, snakes and worms have this uniform wave-like movement. Reich says that plasmatic or mechanical and organotic, that is bioenergetic currents in humans have the same rhythmic wavy wavy character. Reich says that the tapeworm is a kind of slender, creeping, naked, limbless animal. It has a soft body and it's divided into a series of segments. The tapeworm it eats, it transfigures and it becomes its host. This is the coexistence and parasite element. It becomes its host in a process of mutual infection and mutual unnatural participation. This is a Guattarian concept. In this strange interkingdom, where there are myriad interworlds and myriad processes of becoming animal, the worm can turn biopathological and cancerous. The tapeworm orders the cessation of all the movement and flow, okay, and puts the death drive to work. So parasite, coexistence, and the collapse of the body, right? What does this do? What happens as a consequence? There's a shutting out of the world, and the tapeworm, it cuts itself off from others. And incidentally, the wormy man that Reich talks about, you can also find in Kant. Kant says we have this in his philosophy of religion. He says there's a wormy man operating there. Yeah. So, what is this? What is this, this tapeworm? It's alone, it's sedentary, it's adrift, like the Hikikomori, and there's a becoming of the celibate machine of the Hikikomori. The tapeworm is the parasite, and it coexists with the hope. All right, maybe you're thinking, why should we be interested in tapeworms, right? Why should we be interested in tapeworms and earthworms and jellyfish and serpents? Well, I'm insisting that the figure of the Hikikomori exhibits the features of the worm in man. A parasite, insignificant, the Hikikomori withdraws from the world, suffering from the worm in man, a form of contactlessness. On the funk-laden body of the Hikikomori, there are pain waves, this is Reich's concept, but nothing is liberated. The organism is dammed up, it's tense, nothing breathes, nothing is released, all are kept at bay by the narcissism of the self. And without extension, this toing and froing, without extension the Hikikomori is rhythmless. There are no waves, no toing and froing between expansion and contraction. The movement of this innermost worm is petrified. Reich says that excitation waves in the worm have a pulsatory nature, passing from the tail to the head. That's where I think you can find that maybe in some of in Indian philosophy, in the chakras, there's a kind of understanding of that as well. So this, the excitation waves, okay, in the worm, they have a pulsatory nature passing from the tail to the head. So when we pinch the worm, okay, the rings constrict, okay, and it chokes the natural sinuous flow of longitudinal energy streamings, the strömung again. Well, the question is, to what extent this sense of withdrawal, okay, into narcissism is an expression of fascism, okay? So Reich says much about fascism. Is this a fear of life, a fear of the lost love object? And recently I've started, well, I read everything of Han Byung-chul Han, who says something also about the Hikikomori syndrome. Okay, so in some ways my Reich thesis has taken on Han's interpretation as well. Okay, so the fear of the lost love object. Well, before Han Byung-chul, there's also the Reich-influenced Klaus Theloweit, who explains the aim of Nazism is not to give a free rein to the drives, but to escape them. So there's an eruption of drives, as he calls it, but this does not produce some kind of satisfaction, but there's just some kind of stabilization occurs, he says. And this stabilizes what he calls, after Reich, the character armor. So you can imagine this character armor, this protection from the outside, fear of being contacted and things like that. Well, Theloweit insists that fascism only allows the masses to express imprisoned desires. This is another refrain when we look at Theloweit. There is a kind of fateful battle of forces between the total organism of the worm, and the health of the body. The worm, in some sense, gnaws away, sapping the life force in every moment. And this is life in its decline, in its downgoing, if you like. The worm forms a deadly involution in an act of enfolding and entangling, where there's a symbiosis, a coexistence and an interaction, but there's also a double capture of the worm, or even a double capture of the Hikikomori. So the worm, what is this double capture? Well, the worm forms a Hikikomori image. There is a Hikikomori becoming of the worm, and the worm's becoming a social recluse. The worm becomes part of the sexual apparatus of the Hikikomori, as the social recluse becomes the sexual organ of the worm. The worm and the Hikikomori form a disastrous machinic assemblage. Breakdown. Okay. This means the end of sublimation and the free expression of the drives. And this is what Bernard Stiegler will say. When desire is no longer connected with sublimation, no elevation, there is but the kind of base drives which can turn violent and destructive. So, what is the diagnosis? Well, at our most positive, we might imagine that the autistic or the hikikomori is kind of exploring a kind of a new chaosmic universe. Okay, we might say that like it's somehow the hikikomori behavior is somehow exploring what Guattari will call the universes of reference. New technologies open up a new world, right? So we might say that positively. Hikikomori does know that 24/7 gaming, gambling, or I don't know, chatting. This is a new universe of reference. Something is opened up. People connect all around the world, discussing, sharing videos and images and so on. Maybe this is a new way to contact with the world, right? This is our positive reading of it. A new way to connect with the world. Maybe even a new rethinking about desire itself, right? Well, I don't think so, right? Obviously. I think that we need to get the desiring machines working again in new existential milieu. We need to reconfigure territories. We need to find a new comportment to the world. I think we need to put the hikikomori and the autistic in contact with different social constellations. So I don't agree with this kind of positive reading, you know, really. Well, okay, so what is my argument then? Well, I think that if we have a kind of perverse reading of Reich, this might help us to understand the cancerous and toxic forms of societies like Korea and Japan, and further afield. It might help us to understand the model of this chaos, which is the life of the hikikomori. And I think Reich's description of armouring as one of immobility and indifference can be applied to the body of the hikikomori. Why is this so? Because armouring and contactlessness and affect blockage, these are all Reich's concepts. Because of this, the hikikomori refused to experiment with a joyful body. Okay? So, in terms of contactlessness, Reich describes its subjective experience, the subjective experience of feeling inner loneliness or inner deadness or non-being, even in the presence of others. So again, this is where Han Byung-chul somehow connects with Reich. Well, the hikikomori, I think, can be described like this. It's plagued by deep cravings for anxiety intensity. And that's why the hikikomori kind of flails towards catastrophe. It's catastrophic. And in this space, it kind of disorganizes and self-immolates, kind of throws towards death. And it destroys its own health. This is often with excessive communication with machines. Again, this is a kind of autophagy. The body turns cancerous and contactless. The explanation that the strengthening of the ego in the form of a chronic armouring, as opposed both to the id, the primary process, or what Reich calls cosmic orgone energy, and the outer world, this explanation, I think, goes some way to explaining the reality of the hikikomori. Why? Well, the segmentary arrangement of armouring expresses the immobilization and withdrawal of the body. The withdrawal from the world as a consequence of the blockage of orgone, or deadly orgone energy, or DOE, ensures that the waves of desire freeze into segments. So Reich's description of character armour of the mechanistically rigid person begins to sound more and more like the body of the hypochondriac. This is in Anti-Oedipus. And I'm saying that the body of the hypochondriac is like the body of the hikikomori. Again, nothing breathes in the universe of the hikikomori. The slightest disappointment leads to the hikikomori retreat from the world. Okay, so again, I'm going to give another positive reading, okay? And this is the kind of machinic potential of the hikikomori, right? The Deleuzian machine, a machinic kind of metaphor almost. Well, on the occasion that the hikikomori is entombed in funk, playing with games, watching videos and so on, affective intensities may pass between him and his machines. They may go to and fro. Okay? His autoeroticism can enjoin with his love object, like a robot almost, right? And with his micro machines. Okay, maybe this is a line of escape. Okay, a line of escape from the total hell of 24/7 work and slavery in societies like Japan and Korea. So, positively, we might say that the Hikikomori can become unblocked in front of the screen in his universe of reference. Maybe the Hikikomori machinic ensemble, something of desire begins to flow again. Maybe the Hikikomori is deterritorializing on the sensory level. Maybe something's happening there. I think, though, maybe this is so, but there is a double bind at work. And indeed, this is what Guattari says in Molecular Revolutions. He says, in young people, there are desires that clamp down on the joy of the adolescent. These desires cut him or her off from the world. They cut off relations, they cut off connections, and they lead him or her to turn in upon themselves. So again, this toing and froing, the withdrawal in the self, this worm of man. Well, Deleuze and Guattari do say positively that maybe in strategic withdrawal, maybe something else can arise. Maybe this idea of maybe withdrawing from the world as a prelude to building another. Maybe this is strategic and has some possibility. Well, this would mean that the libido would withdraw from the 9-to-5 job, from the capitalist apparatus. Maybe this is where desire finds another way to kind of reconfigure itself. Okay, maybe this is a kind of new kind of ipseity, a new kind of self-relation to itself. Okay, well, I don't agree. Okay, but that's why I've labelled it the deadly spiral of ipseity. Deadly spiral of ipseity. Well, ipseity is, we can say, is the excess or the excitation of the self, the essential element of individuality formed in spirals of pleasure. Ipseity is the concrete core of the subject. So the excesses of pleasures are co-constitutive of this ipseity. Thinking about this in this way, we can say that ipseity is the singularity of the self. And we can say that the ipseity of the self is formed through ethical relations to alterity. And without this relation, there is a disturbance of ipseity. And this is from Parnas and Henriksen's work, a disturbance of ipseity. This is where the self is at odds with itself. It returns to itself and it nestles down deeper into the self. So this withdrawal, this wormy man, this parasite, this sense of coexistence. So it's not the other or the face of the other which opens the ipseity of the hikikomori to the world, but we can say perhaps the extimacy or skin of the machinic object. So this is the kind of positive reading I'm trying to give if you think about the machinic metaphor. Okay, but in this loss of care for the other, ipseity is not hostage to the other, but hostage only to itself. And again, this is where Ham Byung-chul and Franco Berardi, they say something to Wilhelm Reich. I think there's a conversation that can begin there. So what I'm designating as deadly spirals of ipseity is a loss of other regarding self-mastery. So there's a kind of detached autoimmunity, qua self, as self. So we can, what does this mean? It says, at once ipseity is thrown into the world by a kind of bodily comportment. So, and then ipseity would enter the world through the body, but then there's a closing off to the world through the body. So this is the double bind, I guess. So the comportment to the world that forms the sovereignty of the self, okay, this is ipseity as such, also destroys it. That's the fascist, cancerous element, right? And it causes the self to turn towards itself. There's a kind of movement towards abolition, a breakdown, right? And no breakthrough. Right, so what is the way out for the hikikomori? Again, positive. I'm trying to be positive, right? Okay. So positively, we may say, through this extimacy of the machinic object, the singularity of the hikikomori is a unique opening onto the world. So, whereas at the level of individuality, ipseity closes off the world and plunges and spirals into itself. But again, in this way, hikikomori, understood as the worm in man, can be read as a kind of processual schizophrenia or autism. And this would be a diminishing of self-awareness or a disturbance of ipseity. This would be the inner void. This would be the inner void, okay? Or this would be the opacity of consciousness, or a feeling of being surrounded by invisible walls. Right, so what I've said up till now, how does this get us to look at the Hikikomori Syndrome? Well, I think that our concern must be how spirals of pleasure can turn deadly and contactless. I mean, what has happened to desire? So I think the focus is not so much on the orgiastic excess of Reich, the kind of some of the mad ideas like orgone energy and things like that. I don't think we necessarily need to look at that, because we have to understand the misery of the hikikomori first. I mean, we just have to look at what has happened to the social recluse. And I think one way we can use Reich is to look at these, what he calls the centrifugal rings, and how they somehow pull the hikikomori further inside, and this would be the worm which withdraws deeper and deeper into the self, the worm in man, the tapeworm. Okay, this would pull us into ourselves, but pull the self away from a relation to the outside. So this is a coiling or a spiraling, and this would be a kind of deadly involution of the self. There's a deepening of the spirals of malignant subjectivity, and at its worst, this is following Stiegler again. There's a spiraling violence, the unchaining of desire from the drives, the contraction of sensitivity, and the acting out of the drives. I mean, we only have to look at what's happening in America with gun culture, and young people get cut off from the world, and in extremis they turn the guns upon their fellow students, primary schools, and so on. It's dreadful. So I think Stiegler is timely, really, to understand the uncontrollable nature of our controlled society. So again, the mole, the tapeworm, the mole, the serpent, and the tapeworm, there's an interesting kind of passage there. So, and Stiegler would say that the libidinal economy of capitalism leads to lovelessness, to the ruination of desire, and to the enchaining of its drives. This would be a contactless society. And I think we can say that this contrasts with Reich's remedy to the problem of desire, which is to let the natural streaming of bioenergy go unchecked. So it's quite nice to think about the model of the unconscious in Reich and Stiegler, but something might be interesting, worth pursuing there. Well, I'm getting to my conclusion, right? So you can start breathing a little bit. Let the natural streamings move on, right? Well, as we have found, Reich believed if instinctual impulses were denied direct relation to the objects of the world, the result is anxiety. This is the crawling into oneself, and the development of a kind of wall of contactlessness. These are all his language, okay? All his concepts. But what are the dangers to this? Well, I think there's a risk of a deadly involution of feeling and a deepening of the spirals. In our time, I think this has got this is absolutely tragic. Okay, so what is this movement? Okay, we think about the Strömung, the natural streamings, but the movement has turned on itself. It gnaws at itself and spirals further and further into the black hole of fascist subjectivity and narcissism. So this is where Han Byung-chul comes in again, talking about narcissism and the dangers of that. So I think this sense of a deadly form of ipseity, I think, is at odds with the I mentioned. Oh, God, I missed a few there. Forgive me, okay. Well, the last quotation is by Alfonso Linguist. Sorry about that. I think this interpretation is at odds with the kind of insurrectionary exoticism of Linguist, who writes this. He says, torments of pleasure separate and turn on themselves, engendering spirals of ipseity. Pulses of pleasure, spasms of pain vibrate on themselves and feel themselves. The eddy of a self is formed in this conjunctive synthesis, multiple vagabond ipseities, here today, gone tomorrow, circulating on the surface of the body with their organs. Okay, so this would be a kind of, you could say, an insurrectionary philosophy of desire. Nick Land would be part of that, Bataille would be part of that, and Alfonso Linguist. Well, I think in our contemporary moment, I think Reich's sense of vegetative streaming and the notion of affect blockage takes on new significance. The desire of the Hikikomori in its vegetative stage is petrified and frozen, contactless. I think Reich's concept of vegetative streaming is quite positive. I mean, streaming, the natural streamings is taken positively, but we understand this vegetative state a little differently now, really. So what is this? Well, there's a streaming, but it's a form of stimming. It's a perseveration. So there are no streaming sensations of pleasure, no feeling of aliveness, because what's happened is psychic armouring and physical withdrawal work in tandem to prevent the free streaming of energy. Okay, so again, Hikikomori would be an apt description of that. And the biophysical armour of the Hikikomori blocks emotions and the capacity for pleasure and happiness in life. So in some sense, we're all becoming Hikikomori. So this is thankfully, my conclusion, right? So for me, the idea of non-relation and withdrawal as a kind of resistance to excessive communication is a fatal, impotent one, because I think it condones these imploded models of subjectivity, the imploded model of subjectivity of the Hikikomori. So I'm writing against this idea of a non-relation society, a contactless society. So I'm writing against people like Masaya Chiba, who has this kind of negative reading of Deleuze. Okay, we have to be more negative, we can't affirm the philosophy of joy. And indeed, Andrew Culp, who has a whole series of interesting concepts to explain his dark Deleuze thesis. And indeed, I'm writing against Han Byung-chul. I'm not subscribing to Han Byung-chul's thesis because in several respects, Han Byung-chul is writing a very different idea of critique from Masaya Chiba, a Japanese philosopher. So both are concerned with separation and isolation and solitude, but Masaya Chiba embraces a kind of perverse, fashionable, teenage, angst-ridden and dark reading of Deleuze. And he kind of even rejects some of the kind of dark readings of Andrew Culp's dark Deleuze thesis. There's no joyful affirmative critique there, because he's looking at this kind of, Masaya Chiba is looking at these perverted idiosyncratic models of negativity and non-relation and disconnection and indifference, and he cites Deleuze's concept of the vacuoles of non-communication to try and convince us of that. So I think in some ways someone like Masaya Chiba gives a philosophical expression to the sad, marooned, selfish, narcissistic characters you can find in Murakami Haruki's novels. Those characters Chiba seems to describe quite well. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Murakami Haruki, by the way, but I just, And indeed, those concepts of Masaya Chiba, they read like Baudrillard. They read like Baudrillard and the theory of simulacra, and they don't. It seems to me that they don't offer any political vision from that. So I have a problem with that. But and then Han Byung-Chul Han's idea, even his description of fatigue society and break, there is something positive in that. But Han Byung-Chul will turn to Buddhism as a kind of solution, this kind of mindfulness, this kind of state, a kind of exploration of boredom, like a deep boredom sense, right? But I have some problem with that. But there is a very clear, I mean, Han Byung-Chul is bleak, right? But there is a kind of a chink of light in that work, but it's hard to find. So anyway, so I want to say that the isolated hikikomori, okay, remains monadic and impenetrable, and I don't think we can glorify this state. I want to critique it. I can't find any kind of positivity there. Can't glorify it. I don't think there's a war machine at work. I don't think we have this positive machinic vision. Somehow new universes of references emerge. I don't buy that. I don't think we can glorify what Miyadai Shinji calls the island universes. The Hikikomori are these island universes cut off from the world. I can't glorify that because these millions of people are perturbed by a psychotic state of withdrawal into the self. I don't think there's no romance in isolation. Okay, I don't find any romance there. So, in the end, I remain committed to the utopian spirit of Deleuze and Guattari, who say that literally being outside, I think this is my last quote, yes, literally being outside, not being cooked up, is preferable to someone who just withdraws, who just lies on the couch and is miserably motionless. So the quote, a schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model than a neurotic lying in an analyst's couch. So I think something is said from that. So all in all, I guess what I'm arguing for is we need a new diagrammatics of communism, okay, to account for this sad implosion of subjectivity. We need to make, these are Reich's kind of diagrams, we need to make new diagrams to explain our present miserable condition. Thank you very much. Hope I didn't go on.
So, first of all, I would like to thank you for a brilliant lecture. I totally enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and I have two questions. To me, you are coming from a future. Because you are familiar with the situation in Japan, and as I said at the beginning in my introduction, I think the Hikikomori has become a global phenomenon. So it is vitally important to see the role of desire in this respect, and basically ask ourselves what happens to us when we find ourselves in this collective trap of total isolation. So my first question is, to put it simply, what's the relation, and there is an obvious relation, between Hikikomori and the dream of absolute safety? Because it seems to me quite intuitive that what drives Hikikomori, and basically it's confirmed also by the quotes you gave, is this dream of total safety, where no frustration, no danger of physical violence or humiliation may occur. And obviously the human society is dangerous, and interactions are dangerous once they are physical, because there is always a point where the argument can lead to the physical violence. So, or sexual violence, and when we are among people, we feel that you know, I cannot insult Anthony because when he gets angry, he will punch me in the face, and we all know that we need to some extent respect each other when we are together on the internet, when there are technologies that separate us. I can be harsh, or I can use my violence in computer games, and I won't get hurt, no one else will get hurt. But at the same time, of course, this dream of absolute safety is what makes possible fascism, and what drives fascism, because the fascist mentality requires this absolute safety. This is why we long for big strong daddies who make sure that the world becomes absolute heaven and a space of safety where no strangers would harm us and jeopardize or peace, so to say. So my first question is, how would you explain this relation and in terms of desire, between desire for absolute safety and Hikikomori? Because it also shows why, and in this respect I totally agree with you, why Hikikomori leads to global powerlessness. Because only when we physically get together, when we go to the street and we protest, when we make manifestation, we can change the world. But when we are separated, when we can make petitions or whatever, but we are powerless once we stay away from each other physically. So this is why the fascism promotes this dream of absolute safety, and this is why we fall voluntarily into this trap, in my understanding. So I wonder what would be your view on this. And the second question, also you mentioned it, but I would like to hear more about this. What's the relation between social reclusion and self-destruction? Because currently in Czech Republic we see a big wave of suicides among teenagers, not only rising number of mental disorders, but all this is a result of the longest lockdown in Europe, where the schools were closed, and basically the teenagers and kids spent a year, literally a year, in Hikikomori. And now we see the results that have cumulative effects. And so I wonder if there is any statistics about this slide, yet very important step from social suicide, Hikikomori, and real suicide in Japan or in Korea. Because in my view, there is a clear tendency. It's a one-way street, and it seems to me that it also goes along the line of your argument that this is not something we should promote or we should be proud of.
No.
This Hikikomori,
No.
this is precisely the dead end. I wonder if you can say more about this.
Right, thanks for your question. I think I would answer it like this. Some of the arguments coming out from Japan, okay, about Deleuze and Guattari, say it's not so much, it's not so much processual schizophrenia which we should look at anymore, okay? It's not schizophrenia, it's autism, okay? This is this is some of the arguments coming out of the University of Tokyo, and my colleague Kokubun Koichiro, okay, very good Japanese Deleuze scholar, and he says it's not his group there at the University of Tokyo. Some of the arguments are autism helps us to explain the kind of the way society is at the moment. So this idea of processual schizophrenia, or the schizo process, no longer works, right? So that's why the book Anti-Oedipus seems anachronistic now. It doesn't apply to a country like Japan or a city like Tokyo. So A famous Japanese philosopher would be like someone like Asada Akira, who wrote the book Tosoron, which is the theory of escape. He said this was during the 1980s, or kind of Japan was very rich. He said young people are like the frozen by the society. They just have to escape. Tosoron means theory of escape. Just have to escape, get out of there, because the society isn't moving at all. So, but the argument we have now is that idea of the schizo kid, it's belongs to a bygone era, and we have a new series of psychological problems which are occurring in the society. And I'm not an expert on this. I did start to read up on it, but at the University of Tokyo, I would say in the last 20 years, there's been an exploration of what's called Taijin Kyofusho. Taijin Kyofusho means suffering from social anxiety. Okay, that's the fear, not so much of being punched, right? I mean, I fear that all the time, right? But it's not so much the fear of being punched, but the fear of causing offence. Okay, so this has become a real problem in I would say not just Japan but also Korea. The fear of causing offence, which means that you cut off the relations. You just don't even risk kind of a relation to another person, to alterity. So Taijin Kyofusho is something ongoing at the University of Tokyo, and that's connected with this philosophical rumination on autism, which is to say that as far as I understand, someone like Kokuben Koichiro would think like autism is the phenomenological experience of autism is when you can't see behind a surface. So Deleuze talks about this in the Logique de Sens, right? So there is this connection between like a move away from the embarrassing concept of the schizo, right, to a refocus on autism, and then this concept of Taijin Kyofusho, or social anxiety, or the belief that one is offensive, that one is actually in one's makeup offensive, and therefore one should withdraw from the world so you don't offend other people. So that is research ongoing. I'd love to see how that could be applied, for example, in educational context as well. So that's something I did actually begin last year. I kind of tried to think about. As for your other question about suicide, this is Franco Berardi's point, who went to Korea and realised that Korea has these really high rates of youth suicide, as do Japan and Finland and Estonia. And he made a connection between the infrastructure in Korea, which has like the highest internet kind of usage and highest internet rate, and he made a direct correlation between that and the suicide connection. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it was an interesting observation. And given the fact that in Japan there's always this discussion about suicide rates among young people, right? Because the education system is so, what can you say, so competitive, like the Gaokao in China, right? But and with things like school, with bullying and school dropouts, and this idea that if you're not perfect, if you don't fall into the established models, then you're a failure from an early age. So that's where this sense of, or this risk of suicide comes in, and then this idea that I'm a failure, I'm going to withdraw from the world to my computer. This might be a correlation you can make. I mean, it's a very kind of strong correlation you would make, but that would kind of tie into some. And in fact, this is Bernard Stiegler's argument as well. Bernard Stiegler talking about Hikikomori, talking about a kind of ecosophy. Argument is we don't just have like wastelands, environmental wastelands. We have psychical wastelands as well. And that's his argument is that since 1993 and the advent of the World Wide Web, there is this correlation, this kind of risk of phenomenon like hikikomori. There is a risk of young people acting out the drives. There is this danger of young people giving up on the world and in the worst case taking their own lives. So in fact that is kind of very nice research I would like to get into, this idea of taijin kyofisho or social anxiety, but maybe to apply it to the education context, see how it works out. I hope that kind of answers your question.
I have a question as well. First, thank you again for a really wonderful lecture. So, I do have a second question about autism, but maybe that's a broader discussion. But kind of following on from Peter's question about suicide, one of the things I was thinking about during your presentation is, well, it's not the same. I think it's a very closely related phenomenon that is happening in the West, specifically North America and Europe right now, is incel culture.
Right.
Right? So you have the same kind of withdrawal from society, the same kind of insulation, but then there's some kind of interesting differences, because part of incel culture is precisely the communication, because it is a community.
Right.
And far from a drive to security, incel culture has this notion of the black pill. So like in the alt-right discourses, that they've kind of plagiarized this notion from the Matrix, the blue pill and red pill, and the red pill is like the awakening. So incel culture has built on that and said, no, we actually want the black pill. The black pill is the awakening, but it's an awakening to the uselessness and futility of life. As such, better to commit suicide by way of mass shooting. So these mass shooting incidents are a form of suicide, and it's a form of trying to take the world with you. But it seems as though there's a related phenomena here about this kind of withdrawal, that kind of desire turned against itself. But the desire is assembled in a very different way, and still, because I think one of the problems when some people talk about desire is that they tend to fall back on a kind of psychoanalytic thinking of it. Whereas, like Guattari especially talks about how it has to be communal. That desire doesn't exist unless it exists between individuals. So it's interesting to think about this in relation to the community where desire is turned against itself.
Well, that's I didn't think about that, but I think that you could easily make an argument that would connect with something like taijin kyofisho, the social anxiety in Japan. Now, in incel culture, kind of demonstrates several of the theses of Deleuze and Guattari, I would say. As you said, there's a need for communication, right? Even the kind of the black pill nihilistic kind of drive, there's a need for communication. But then incel culture would be kind of a withdrawing from relation to the other. Would be, I'm not going to risk that. It's already, as you said, a kind of doomed. It's kind of, it's already kind of pointless to do that. So, but then that would mean, what is that relation of desire? What is that relation of desire in that community which is nihilistic, which is given up on orthodox ways to comport oneself to the world? Well, then positively you could look at incel culture as a kind of universe of reference, okay, let's say it like that in the Guattarian sense, like this new community that is formed is the black pill would be that universe of reference. Something is opened up, a new thinking about desire, even if it's black or bleak or fatalistic or violent, but it would be a new possibility. So in that way, someone like Guattari is very utopian and very affirmative, technophilic almost about technology. But of course, whether you read incel culture as a positive desire is something else. But I would say that, and I got this recently from Han Byung-chul, because he was critical of the beautiful concept of the line of flight in Deleuze and Guattari. He said this was really just a way to describe capitalism. Yeah, but I don't agree with that. I think that the line of flight is that kind of it's a very positive opening, a new possibility. But in your example of incel, the line of flight would be the kind of dangerous line of flight, right? It would be like an abnormal or excrescent kind of experimentation. So it depends how you read it. I mean, a group like incel culture would be. Well, how would you look at it? I mean, there is something there. People enjoy being together, even though they're experimenting with the black pill, as you called it, right? So that's something I'm going to look at. I think the idea of social anxiety in Japan and incel culture might be some way to rethink desire. Yeah.
If no one else has a question, I actually want to push back on the idea of autism as well. But all right. So returning to this idea of how in Japan that they're saying we can't look at schizophrenia any longer.
Right.
It's autism.
Right.
Which is really interesting to hear because it's so much the kind of mirrored opposite of what we have in the West in both northern and southern hemispheres, right? This idea that like in psychoanalytic, the Lacanians now are saying we can't even think of neurosis anymore; it's only psychosis. Even Franco Berardi, argues this as well, right? But what's really interesting is to think about this through autism, because of course Guattari's whole concept of the schizoanalytic cartographies comes from the work with autistic children, and the stuff that Deleuze was doing in how autism constructs different worlds outside of traditional semiotization. So I was wondering if maybe if you can kind of flesh this out a little bit more, how a Japanese concept, because autism, at least coming from the line of the thread of Deleuze, is about constructing new worlds. It's about new openings rather than a kind of. It almost seems as though the autism that they're perhaps discussing in Japan almost sounds more like what perhaps you might call an obsessional neurosis, rather than autism as such, rather than neurodivergency.
Well, that's a great question. I wonder if the description of autism in Japan by the Japanese philosophy is thinking about a kind of social autism, whether it's taken on a social dimension. There is that. The other side of it is the phenomenological exploration of autism, which they look to the logic du sens to understand. Robinson on the island and that kind of idea. The description of the phenomenological experience of autism would be a kind of, it would be that kind of excess of phenomena. There's a kind of there's too much that is coming into consciousness. So there's a kind of a description. This is Kokumin Koichiro's kind of reading anyway. This would be the kind of he gives an example from his research, which is let's imagine a meadow, right? Now the phenomenological kind of autism would see every flower within that meadow as a singularity, as deserving a name to it. So there's a kind of it's an overflow of information almost, right? Perceptual information. So that means this necessity to name every flower. I mean, that's why you cut off from the world, because you know it's too much, right? Well, we would name a medal, then the infinite singularities of the medal, that's too much. That means just can't do that. I think that is the kind of medical understanding, using Deleuze's concepts, again referring to the logic du sens. Yeah, I don't know. I have to kind of. I don't know. I think some of the. Okay, so how about this? So, I think that it became kind of the schizo concept, which was, as far as I know, was like one of the top 10 buzzwords. Was it? Would have been around 1984.
Yeah.
So the translations of Deleuze and Guattari came out very fast in Japan, so many people are familiar with the work there. So it was a buzzword in the newspaper in the top 10. Everybody knew schizo, everybody was called schizo, and it became fashionable, and then it lost its fashion. And then people would, I guess the researchers have kind of feel uncomfortable and say, oh, what are you researching? I'm researching the schizo. It's kind of, what is that? What are you doing, you know? So again, there might be a move away from that, which some people might see as a kind of childish kind of 1960s kind of concept, to a more kind of medical interpretation of what autism is, which would, again, be a kind of a real phenomenology. Yeah. I don't know, I'm not sure I answered your question there, but...
no, you did. You did. That's really interesting. It does point to the need for people to also read Guattari, you know, in addition to Deleuze.
Well, that's right, yeah. I mean, that's always been my thing, you know, so, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for that.
We done?
Maybe I would ask a question about what it means to be hikikomori in Japan, because maybe it may be appropriate to quote someone we were speaking about autism, who was diagnosed with Asperger.
Yes.
Elon Musk. who said that lockdowns heavily diminished his belief in humanity, as it is just a form of mass house arrest. And well, this confining. I read something on Hikikomori, and that was just just passing, mentioning this, that basically house arrest is not something that is perceived as a punishment in Japan, which is quite the opposite here, you know. So what it means to be hikikomori and this broader social context, of course autism heavily I mean, this interpretation of autism and I mean being overwhelmed by the sensation and then the flood of information and whatever. It reads almost like Ernst Mach or something like this.
I don't know. I mean, what I didn't mention in the talk was the otaku culture, like geek culture, right? Which a few years ago, I would say, was kind of like not frowned upon as such, was seen as kind of very minor. But now, isn't everybody otaku? Isn't everybody into like some kind of obsessive behaviour? Isn't?
Yeah.
So then, the idea of playing a computer game for 20 hours and
The stimming.
right, the stimming, right? Yeah. So I wonder if that's become a kind of acceptable form of behaviour in some way. This idea of non-relation. I mean, looking in the broader demographic, I mean, the idea of getting married, forming a relation, as you know, in countries like Korea and advanced industrial societies like Korea and Japan, getting married becomes something you do later in life. So forming a relationship, having children, getting a mortgage and having all that kind of thing, people don't want to do that, right? Because that's too much work. So some of the conurbations, like Tokyo, more than half of the people live by themselves, because they, right? I mean, just totally normal, not hikikomori, but population, what is it, 30 million in Tokyo, right? So half of those people, in some way, live by themselves. We're very happy to have a non-relation society in a way, because it's convenient, the keyword, convenient. So that, in that way, that's acceptable, right? But I think hikikomori is something else. Hikikomori is, I mean, I have students like this. That's why I write them, and my students become like this. You know, it's devastating. They want to have a relation to the outside, but they just can't for all kinds of reasons. So they withdraw, and this fear of this anxiety of the social and causing anxiety. That's deep into the psyche. That's become deep into the psyche. I think that's a medical phenomenon, really. The idea of like otaku culture, being into something, well, I think that's kind of, it's everywhere now, isn't it? Don't know. I don't know. It's interesting to think about that way. But I tried, as I said, I try not to do it like the book I've been doing is not trying not to do it sociologically, but to use some philosophical concepts, because I think that I just wonder why we do philosophy, although if it's just, I mean, what's the point, really? I mean, yeah.
No, this is more of a comment maybe, but when you were asking the question, so what is the experience of hikikomori, and you were saying that your students want to have that connection to the outside, but they just can't.
Yeah.
So it almost sounds like there's a kind of like a standing reserve of desire.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it's somehow it's hard to think about this without thinking of like Bataille or someone. But this idea of a surplus of desire that's there but it can't be channeled out. So it's not so it's like what's happening desire? Maybe this desire has been stagnated or kind of crystallized in a way. So it just isn't moving. It's just there as a kind of reserve. I don't. Again, that's just a comment, but it's just something that's interesting to think about that with the tapeworm and this idea of it kind of just sits there.
Yeah.
You know, in your bowels. You know, doesn't
That's
go,
right.
doesn't come. It just sits.
That's right.
I have a similar reflection, and I wonder if you could confirm it. And I'm still trying to think of hikikomori in terms of desire, and I think at least what you mentioned at the beginning helps me out a bit, because when you referred to sex with the robots, also a robot serving as a priest, which is a marvelous idea. But to think about this idea in terms of desire seems to me as something that allows us to approach the social reclusion, because what's the point in such a social reclusion? It's it's like having a sex relation with a robot, which means that the robot cannot harm me by the neglect, by ignorance, or by saying no, and at the same time I can do everything to the robot and with the robot. So I can show my omnipotence, and at the same time I'm in a safe haven. I'm in a space of total safety where nothing, including embarrassment, can harm me. And maybe this is what, at least for me, explains this point where we get stuck in social reclusion. That this is what we require, what we expect, what we dream of in hikikomori, and at the same time it also shows why it's a dead end and why it's a trap. That no movement forwards is actually possible once we get stuck in this point of desire. I wonder if.
Well, I think the way you described it is perfect, because my interest in Guattari has always been this idea of the refrain and being in an existential milieu, a kind of from his ecosophy. So the refrain would be a kind of, you can get caught in deadly refrains, like this stimming record might be something you could think about like that. But this idea of like, of this kind of a deadly repetition. This is what Guattari calls a deadly repetition. This is when you get kind of stuck, right? And this is when the milieu that you create, the existential milieu, gets stuck. You get caught in a refrain and you repeat it, and there's no relation to the outside. So there's no breakthrough. There's a kind of, spiraling breakdown, really. So that for me that's always in the back of my mind. I imagine, we're drawing into your room, not coming out for 6 months, playing video games, incel culture and things like this is a kind of deadly refrain. You get caught in something, and that's why I was thinking about the deadly spirals of ipseity. Kind of you have a sexual relation, but it's machinic, right? Yeah. That's a positive Guattarian reading, but it sounds perverse to me. But I mean, fine. But then, as you said, you have a relation, maybe a relation to a love object, but it's not reciprocal. There's no risk. So again, that we're talking about the idea of social anxiety and things like that. So nothing is risks, but you are kind of satisfying kind of base drives, right? Now, all of what you just said reads like someone like Han Byung-chul, who talks about narcissism and about the failure to take a risk towards the other. So we become caught in these narcissistic deadly repetitions where we're just serving ourselves, but nothing is exposed, nothing is given over to the other. So I think, in some ways, Han Byung-chul is very easy to read, and I did that within 2 weeks. I read everything I got my hands on. But I want to see how someone like Han Byung-chul can work with Stiegler, can work with Guattari and Deleuze, and with Berardi and people like that, and to see what happens with, and Reich, of course, because I think there's a discussion that needs to take place with that. I mean, my thing has always been about these repetitions we get caught in, and this is what R.D. Lang, I just came back from Glasgow. I went to the R.D. Lang archives, the university there, and I listened to a lecture, one of the first, and Guattari was with him, R.D. Lang, and you can tell how young they are because Guattari's voice is like very high pitched. So that's how young they are, 19, maybe 69, 70s, was very early. And R.D. Lang's lecture, he says, that he gives an example of being caught in a repetition, kind of an illness, and how something like the Deligny and the autistics and wandering lines, and somehow even Guattari's example of the schizophrenic in the car finding a way to make a new relation with a machine opens up something. So something is opened up to the outside, and something is experimented upon, and there's a line of flight and all that, and something can make a breakthrough. And R.D. Lang's point was that we're just the beginning to understand of daring to take, he says this at the end of the lecture, daring to take the risk to find a breakthrough. Now, I'm not sure I find a breakthrough in Hikikomori Syndrome, but I tried to give it a positive reading, this idea of a kind of machinic relation, or maybe marrying a robot, I don't know, whatever. But maybe that's just what it's about. And I said Guattari is very technophilic. I mean, he tried to find in technology this way to open up a new vista to the world. So maybe there is something there. But that is the very positive kind of a reading of it. But I don't know where the idea of joy would come from in incel culture, or from withdrawing from the world. I don't know what that joy might be. And I think, I'm still with the Deleuzian philosophy of affirmation. I'm not going to shift from that kind of dogmatic insistence that Deleuze was a philosopher of affirmation, and the job of philosophers is to find joy, is to promote joy, disseminate it. Anyway, I'm not sure I answered that question either, you know.
Yeah, this is it. Thank you very much.